Welcome once again to our Wednesday night Bible study upon this rock. I'm here in my study. I'm inviting you in to join me as I study through John's Gospel and just share with you what the Lord is showing me as I study. Just before we do that, Janice is going to bring us another classic old song of worship. So worship along with her and then rejoin us here and we'll start looking at John chapter 5 together. Okay, last week we were looking at John chapter 4. We looked at the healing of the nobleman's son that followed on after the incident with Jesus meeting with the Samaritan woman at the well. And now we're at John chapter 5. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews. Again, there were three major festivals that every religious Jew was supposed to attend, if at all possible, in Jerusalem. One of them was Passover, another was Pentecost, and the third was Purim, the festival that celebrated Esther's intervention to save the Jewish people from all of the plots of Haman in the book of Esther. So this is actually the third, now we're only in John chapter 5, but this is already the third time Jesus is in the surroundings of Jerusalem. He was in the Judean countryside when John the Baptist was baptizing. Then he was in Jerusalem for the Passover whenever he cleansed the temple. And now he's back there again for, it doesn't say which festival, but it was probably one of the big three, either Passover, Pentecost, or Purim. And verse 2 says, "Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades." Now, this pool of Bethesda, for a long time people thought maybe this was fictional. People who didn't believe in the inspiration of the Bible thought this was made up, because they said there's been no such pool found with 5 sides, with these porches, 5 porches. But in fact, it was there all along. It had been discovered over 100 years ago. And it was only recently the archaeologists realized that what they had thought was a four-sided rectangular pool actually had two basins with a wall in between them, which together with the four-sided pool made a five-sided pool. And they realized that each one of these sides had a portico on it as well. So actually fitting perfectly with the description here in John chapter 5. So now we know where the Pool of Bethesda was, and you can actually visit it if you visit Jerusalem. Now, the two basins that it talks about, one flowed down into the other. One was like a reservoir, and then there was a channel and it flowed down from that into the lower basin. And that tells us that this pool was used as a mikveh, which was a Jewish pool for the rites of purification. It was open to the public, where people could go in and carry out the ritual washings that were required before they would go and offer a sacrifice in the temple. Now, it has also been noted, by the way, that whenever John says, now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate, that this is one of the arguments used for saying that John's gospel was written before 70 AD. Because, of course, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed and left with not one stone left standing on another. And the fact that John's talking about the pool and the sheep gate in the present tense would indicate to many Bible scholars that John is writing before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Some people have thought that John's gospel was written much later, but that's an argument that it was actually written earlier. And then in verses 3 and 4, it says, here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And actually my translation here, the New International Version, jumps straight from verse 3 to verse 5. Because verse 4 says this, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. And the first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. Now, the reason why that doesn't appear in my translation, but does appear in some Bible translations, is that the oldest manuscripts that we have do not contain verse 4. And it's thought that it was added maybe 100 years later, sometime in the 2nd century, as an explanation after the destruction of Jerusalem, and as the gospel was being preached much more in Gentile countries around the world and other parts of the world, that people wouldn't understand the story and why it was so important for this man to get into the pool before anybody else. And so this would be like an explanation. So we do think that this is authentic in that it's telling the truth, but it may not have been part of the original manuscript of John's Gospel. A little bit like today, sometimes you'll buy a Bible and there'll be explanatory notes in the margins. Well, this may have been one of the notes in the margins that gradually began to be included with the text itself. Either way, it seems to be reliable. It goes right back to at least the 2nd century AD. So whether or not it should be in the biblical text itself, it stands as a good illustration, whether you want to have it in the text or have it in the margin at the side of the page beside the actual text. Verse 5. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? Now here's something amazing. All these sick people, they're all there looking at the water. They're looking intently at the water because, you know, whenever the water, the angel of the Lord would come and stir up the waters and they'd all start bubbling, they wanted to be the first one to jump in and get their healing. So they're looking to the waters for the healing. And while they're there with their eyes fixed on the waters of the pool, guess who's standing among them all? Jesus, the real source of healing, is among them. And I tell you, there's an entire sermon there. Oh my goodness, I'll have to preach that sermon some Sunday. That there were these people and they're looking everywhere else for their healing except to the one who can really heal and who is standing among them. And then Jesus speaks to this one guy, a guy who's been crippled, paralyzed for 38 years. And Jesus says, "Do you want to get well?" Now, on the face of it, that seems like a stupid question, but Jesus asked questions like this. I mean, he would say to a blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" And I believe the reason was because Jesus loved people to speak their need out. Because as they spoke out their need and asked for help, that became a cry of faith. And that's quite important to us, because sometimes we feel, well, you know what, maybe I shouldn't keep praying for this thing. God knows I need it anyway. Yeah, God may know that you need it. Of course, he knows what you need before you know that you need it. But God likes to hear you ask. God loves you to take that step of faith to pray for something, and he moves in response to faith. So Jesus asked the man, "Do you want to get well?" Verse 7, "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Even when miracles are happening, we all need somebody to help us. Here was this pool where people were getting healed, but this guy was not receiving the healing because he had nobody to help him. You know what? You can have a church that's great preaching, great worship, everything else, but people aren't going to get saved unless somebody helps them, unless somebody invites them in and brings them along to church. Without somebody to help them, they're not going to avail of all of the answered prayer, the miracles, the blessing, the fellowship, the word that is waiting to be received. Verse 8. Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And at once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. And the day on which this took place was a Sabbath. I love the simplicity of the way that Jesus heals people. You've got this rigmarole of a pool where the waters bubble up. You've got all these people sat all day long watching the pool, waiting for that one moment when it might start bubbling and they could jump in and be there first. And in contrast to all of that complicated procedure and all that competitiveness, Jesus just says to this man, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." And at once the man was cured. Pure simplicity. You know, religion makes a rigmarole out of everything. Religion makes everything complicated. Religion says you've got to do it all in a particular way according to a certain ceremony. But Jesus just comes along and speaks the word, and the word makes miracles happen. I want to say today, no, even when religion's making everything complicated, a simple faith in Jesus Christ and his word is the surest way to see our prayers answered and to see miracles happening. By the way, this is the third miraculous sign in John's gospel. The first one was the turning of water into wine at Cana. That was in John chapter 2. The second miraculous sign was in John chapter 4, the healing of the nobleman's son. And now this is the third of John's 7 miraculous signs that he builds his gospel around. And this is the healing of the crippled man by the pool. And it says here, it happened on the Sabbath. Why is that important? Well, because of what comes next. Verse 10. And so the Jews, and it's really the Jewish leaders, John uses the phrase, the Jews, to refer specifically to the Jewish authorities. John himself was a Jew. When John uses this phrase, Jesus was a Jew, but when John uses this phrase, the Jews, he's not talking about himself, he's not talking about Jesus, he's not trying to pretend that him or Jesus were Gentiles, he's talking about the Jews, the Jewish authorities. And so these Jewish religious leaders, they immediately say to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, the law forbids you to carry your mat." Well, actually the law in the Word of God, the law in the Old Testament, it forbade people to work. Now, what was the definition of work? They said carrying a mat. A man who had just been healed, carrying his mat home, constituted work. There was even debates about whether having your false teeth in your mouth was work or not. Because if you kept your false teeth in, you were carrying your teeth on the Sabbath day and possibly breaking the Sabbath. Again, religion just makes takes what is supposed to be simple and makes it unendurably complicated. So anyway, they criticize this guy because he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath. Now, but here's the crazy thing. They must have known this guy. I mean, this guy has been crippled for 38 years. You know, if these religious leaders have been anywhere around Jerusalem in the last 38 years, they've seen this guy. They know him. They know he's pitifully crippled. And now he's walking about healed. And instead of asking about how did you get healed, they want to pick a fight about him carrying his mat on the Sabbath day. And they're missing out on an essential truth. And it's this: often the miraculous is messy. God does not always do things neatly according to our traditions. You know, there are times whenever things happen and people's lives aren't quite where they ought to be, but God does a miracle for them and they want to speak about that miracle, and we should be celebrating that with them. But these Pharisees, these religious leaders, they're just, you know what, they want everything to be absolutely perfect, and if it doesn't quite fit in with all their regulations about, man-made regulations about the Sabbath, then they're going to conclude that this was not a work of God. I hate to confess this, I'm ashamed to confess this, but I once had a similar attitude. I can remember as a new Christian, I'd been sitting under some teaching of some judgmental preachers and started to become quite judgmental myself. I was young, I was immature, and sometimes the people who are the most judgmental, they are the ones who are the most immature. Well, I was immature, and I remember somebody talking about a famous rock musician who had given his life to Jesus, and I said to them, well, you know what? I saw he was holding a concert on a Sunday, so he can't be that saved. Oh, I cringe when I look back. I was just like these Jewish Pharisees. Here was wonderful that somebody who had been lost in darkness had given their life to Jesus, and I was all hung up about whether he played a concert on a Sunday or not, in my youthful and immature judgmentalism. You know, I encountered a similar thing lately. A couple of years back, I wrote a review for a movie, Unplanned. The movie is a story about how somebody was part of a manager of an abortion clinic and gradually came to respect the value of human life and became to see life from a pro-life perspective. And after I gave this movie a positive review, I got a stinging letter from somebody telling me how wrong I was because in the movie, her and her family celebrated Halloween and other things that they didn't do that were right and everything else. But the story wasn't saying this woman was perfect. It was saying, look, here's the pro-life argument. The fact that an unborn child is worthy of protection is not just something for perfect Christians. It's something that everybody can understand and have a transformation in their life as a result. But these people that sent me that letter, they were hung up over the details and missed out on the wondrous central message of that movie. Well, these Jewish Pharisees, they were just the same. The guy's got healed after 38 years of being paralyzed, and all they can do is get upset because he's breaking the Sabbath according to their interpretation of it. Oh my goodness. Sometimes human nature doesn't change. Verse 11. So when they said it's the Sabbath, the law forbids you to carry your mat. But he replied, the man who made me well said to me, pick up your mat and walk. The Sabbath issue is actually here. They're not using it as an excuse to attack Jesus, because the religious leaders don't even know Jesus is involved at this point. They're just being jerks, to be honest. But this guy gives a straight and compelling answer. He says, well, I'm carrying my mat because the guy who healed me told me to carry my mat. And if he has the power to heal me, I reckon he knows what he's talking about. But listen to the next verse, verse 12. So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" Oh, what a revealing question, the way they worded it. Because, do you know what? Anyone normal would have said, "Who is this fellow who healed you?" That would be the big question. You've received a miracle. Who was it who healed you? They don't even mention the healing. The healing's there. A miracle is standing in front of them. And instead of saying, "Well, who was it who healed you?" they say, "Well, who was it who said that you could carry your mat? Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" And their words just show where their heart is. Verse 13, "The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there." You see, Jesus had healed this guy as an act of compassion and mercy and grace. He wasn't trying to create a stir. He wasn't starting a healing crusade and healing every single person that was lying by the pool that day. He just looked at this guy, knew that he had been there 38 years, and just in absolute compassion spoke healing over him. Verse 14, "Later Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you.'" Jesus went to see the man again because getting healed is not enough. Do you know, there are times when people receive a miracle and then we never see them in church again. They come, they get prayed for something, they receive a miracle. I remember years ago, my wife and I were we'd just resigned from a denomination and we were looking for a church to attend. And up in the area where Janice's grandmother lived, and we were going to be staying with her grandmother, we saw a newspaper report about a church where a baby had been raised from the dead. Literally, a baby had died and been declared dead in hospital. The church had started praying. They got news this baby had died. They started praying and the baby was restored to life. And that spoke to us. And we looked at each other. We said, "Wow, well, let's check this church out." And we were part of that church for 5 years until we came back to Ireland. But here's the funny thing. I discovered later the family of the baby that was raised to life again never came back to church. They got their miracle and that was it. But God doesn't want us to stop at a physical miracle, at a healing, because these are supposed to be signs that point us to faith in Jesus Christ himself. And so Jesus comes back to speak to this guy in the temple. He's already got his healing, but now Jesus wants to give him something better. Jesus wants to speak into his spirit. And look at what Jesus says to him, because Jesus makes clear now that it wasn't because of his goodness that he had been healed, because he was a sinner. Jesus said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." Jesus is making clear that even if somebody's paralyzed for 38 years, their number one problem is not the paralysis problem. Their number one problem is the sin problem. And fixing the paralysis problem should only be a pointer to them receiving the better healing when Jesus heals their sin problem. Now, Jesus says something worse might happen to you. You say, "Well, what could be worse than lying crippled for 38 years? Well, going into eternity without Jesus Christ would be an awful lot worse. And that's why Jesus comes back and speaks to him again. Verse 15. This blows my mind. "The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well." This guy is a nasty piece of work. He knew the Pharisees were after the person who had told him to pick up his bed on the Sabbath. Technically, you could be stoned to death for breaking the Sabbath. So in wanting to know who did this, who said this to you, it's not a nice question. It says, who was that? It's not a case of who was that man, I want to shake his hand. It's a case of we want to get our hands on this guy because we're going to deal with him because he's broken the law. And the guy goes straight to them and says, "You know who it was? It was that Jesus guy. That's who it was." he didn't know, but that by going and saying who it was and immediately telling the religious leaders who it was that had healed him and told him to pick up his bed and walk, he could be signing that man's death warrant. Why did he do it? Maybe he was intimidated by the religious leaders. Maybe he thought he would get some kind of a reward from them. Whatever way, he's a nasty piece of work. And what that tells me is, once again, that his healing was not because he deserved it or because he was righteous or anything else. It was in spite of his moral condition. It was an act of grace. And perhaps it explains why he had no friends to help him into the pool. If this was the way he behaved to people that helped him, then it's no wonder he didn't have any friends. But it also serves to help us to avoid falling into the trap of looking at people that are suffering and thinking we should only help those who deserved to be helped. You know, this has often been the case when charity has been given out. Often there's been an attempt to distinguish between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Those who are poor or suffering through no fault of their own, oh, let's do all we can to help them. But if that person's poor because of their own choices or their own decisions or whatever, it's their own fault, just let them rot. And that's often the way charity operates, where it tries to help the deserving poor, but neglects to help the undeserving poor. God's love is not like that. God reaches out to the person who doesn't deserve his grace, who doesn't deserve his love. Jesus did that with the man by the pool, and he did it with you and me whenever he saved us. And I'm so glad that he did. We're going to call it a night now. We're going to halt there at the end here of verse 15, and we'll come back and start again at verse 16 in John chapter 5 next Wednesday. So please do join us again next Wednesday night for another episode of Upon This Rock. It'll be here in my study, same time, 7:30 p.m., same day, Wednesday, same place, here in my study. Please join us then. Thank you for joining us tonight, and may God bless you in Jesus' name.